from the NFL in our nation's capital. The Commanders are hiring that man, Kliff Kingsbury, to be their offensive coordinator. Why is this so huge? He, of course, spent last fall as USC's quarterbacks coach and senior offensive analyst, meaning he worked directly with Caleb Williams, who projects to be the #1 overall pick in this year's draft. And as Adam Schefter tweeted, let the speculation begin. Kingsbury coached Caleb Williams last season. Williams was a standout quarterback at Gonzaga High School in Washington, D.C. The Commanders currently hold the #2 overall pick and are in striking distance of the #1 pick that belongs to Chicago. So Schefty's got the speculation going. Caleb Williams, meanwhile, in what could be described as an innocent post on Instagram, just says, "My dog, congrats." That's the definition of plausible deniability. Is it not? And so there's Neek, who also is in the D.C. area and thus will have insight into all of this. But Dan, I will start with you. Is the speculation now going to run wild about the possibility that the Commanders will do everything in their power to go up and get Caleb Williams from Chicago?
Yeah, because it had already been out there for a while that the new ownership in Washington has been sort of interested in the idea of, can you get Caleb Williams, local kid, make a big splash? Again, new ownership, trying to establish something there in D.C. So that will be out there. The question, of course, becomes, can they do it, right? If the Bears are set on taking Caleb Williams, then this isn't going to happen. It reminds me of 2020 when the Bengals had the 1 pick and the Dolphins and some other teams were making overtures to try and go up and get the 1 pick and take Joe Burrow, and the Bengals just said no to everybody because they were sure that's who they wanted. Now, are the Bears as sure on Caleb Williams? Might they keep Justin Fields? Would they be okay with trading back to 2 and taking Drake May? That's all going to float out there for a while, and Bears GM Ryan Poles, who went through a similar situation to this last year, is going to look at all his options. I'm confident of that. Also important to note that Drake May, who I think a lot of people think could be the second quarterback taken, played at North Carolina for a coach named Phil Longo, who was the offensive coordinator there for a while, who runs kind of an air raid style offense similar to what Kingsbury runs. So it could be that Drake May could play in a Kingsbury system too. But to your point, yes, the speculation now gets going full speed.
And the name Jaden Daniels from LSU, the Heisman winner, will come into the conversation somewhere as well. I've been studying every mock draft and everything that comes out. All of them have Caleb Williams first, and then I would say they're sort of split on #2. Some of them Drake May, some of them Jaden Daniels. The question is, Domonique, it's an interesting choice of words that Schefter used, that Washington is within striking distance of the #1 pick. Well, that distance can be however long the Bears want it to be, right? Sure. The Bears can make that distance just a little bit if they want it to be, or they can make it a chasm that no one could possibly get across. What do you think, Neek?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're worried about what the Bears want and what Washington wants, but there are some certain opportunities, rare opportunities, where it does matter what the player wants. And when the player is as good as Caleb Williams, we can see times in the past, you can go back to John Elway or Eli Manning, where they forced their way to a place where they were more comfortable. And while I know it's going to rub people the wrong way, there's nothing more important to a quarterback than where he lands to start his career. It's going to determine how things go going forward. So I think Caleb Williams will be wise to consider what leverage he has to get to the place where he wants to be. And Chicago is a really great football town, but I'm not sure that they have a great track record. Actually, I'm not even going to try to be diplomatic. They have a pretty terrible track record of developing quarterbacks there. So it's worth considering moving to another place. Not that Washington has a great history either, but figuring out where he can get himself to feel comfortable, and having your college quarterbacks coach in a location might make it a little bit more comfortable for a quarterback like Caleb Williams.
Let's remove any semblance of diplomacy from the conversation. Chicago is my adopted second home, and I love it more than I can put into words. Chicago, for 100 years, has been where quarterbacks' careers go to die. That's what Chicago is, and so if Caleb Williams does have an interest in trying to force a situation, it wouldn't be that surprising.
Literally the only franchise that has never had a 4,000-yard passer in a season.
I mean, you got to go back to Sid Luckman, maybe 1 year of Jim McMahon for outstanding quarterback play. Now, all that just takes one person to change.
Sure.
Because I remember when we were speculating, you just mentioned Joe Burrow. I remember we were speculating sitting right in these chairs.
Yes.
Is Joe Burrow going to force his way out of Cincinnati? Does he not want to go to Cincinnati? Well, look how that has all worked out. Obviously, they've been in the Super Bowl and whatever else. D. Wood, what do you think of all this?
So a couple things for me, and I think Dan already referenced it. Number one, sizzle, right? Like, Dan Quinn is not a sizzle hire if you're the Washington Commanders.
Right.
You come in, new ownership, you want something splashy for the fan base. What could be more splashier than having a local kid, moving up to the #1 spot and having him be the face of your franchise? That's why this whole thing just smells like something's going on here, obviously, with Kliff Kingsburg. Also, I will point out the discussion that we had this morning on production meetings, like, as it relates to the Bears, what exactly do you want to draft Caleb Williams, or do you have an opportunity move down one spot and collect a lot more draft picks to build around your team, and you're still able to get one of the top quarterbacks in this draft? That's something that my fellow BC guy, Ryan Poles, general manager Ryan Poles, is going to have to really think long and hard about.
Right. The equation is, would you rather have Caleb Williams, or would you rather have one of those other guys, May and Daniels, plus whatever draft picks you can get, right? I mean, once upon a time, the Bears went from 3 to 2, right, to get Mitch Trubisky, and they threw an extra couple third-round picks at the 49ers to do it. So there is a framework for that if you're talking about trading up one spot.
I want to dive back into the one that Neek mentioned a moment ago, because there's what the teams want, and then there's what the player wants. So what exactly, Neek, like, give me the blueprint for this. I'm old enough to remember Elway. Elway threatened to go play baseball.
Right.
Eli Manning had, sort of the clout of the Manning family and all the rest of that, and was able to engineer his way out of San Diego. But it's not easy to do. At the end of the day, the player doesn't have a whole lot of say in what one. So give me the playbook if indeed they do decide they don't want to go someplace.
Caleb could go back to school is the playbook, and there's no guarantee that the Bears will have the #1 pick again next year. Or he could be a player who is just unhappy to be there, which is when you have that level of power. We're not accustomed to it in football, but we are in basketball. And frankly, quarterbacks are the only players in the league that have similar leverage to NBA stars. So I think that is the leverage. I don't want to be there. I'll go do something else. I won't show up. Caleb Williams can do that given the way that money is made in college right now. He probably has enough to survive for a year, or he can go back and still get paid. So it's leverage that he has. It may not make him a very likable person, but if you get in the right location and you win enough, then people will forget all about that. No one brings up the John Elway thing except once every 5 years when there's a quarterback who's up like this. We think about John Elway as a Super Bowl champ and a Hall of Famer, not nearly as much about him forcing his way to a team that he wanted to play for.
Of course. John Elway is one of the most beloved former players in NFL history, and so is Eli Manning. All that stuff will be long since forgotten. And as far as Caleb Williams' finances, I'm not his accountant, but I see him on every commercial during the college football season, right? So he's got to be doing okay. So there's that story running down one track, and we should repeat. We don't know that he doesn't want to go to Chicago. He may very well want to. Chicago would be the best place to become a great quarterback because they have been starving for one. It is an enormous, fabulous, passionate market. Just ask Michael Jordan. Now, his career worked out being drafted into Chicago. So that could work out extraordinarily well for him. The story going down the other parallel track is, if you're the Bears, you are able to now create you already were, but this only adds to it, a bidding war. You could get a treasure trove for that #1 pick.
I remember talking to Ryan Poles at last year's Combine and talking about, before they had done the trade with Carolina, obviously, and he was talking about this year's draft, talking about the 2024 draft as like the one you want more picks in. Like that, this could be a generational talent pool. And so, yes, I think it's entirely I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility to think that he would look at that and say the ability to amass more picks in this year's draft is enticing, maybe even more than but again, we don't know where their evaluation has landed or will land on Caleb Williams. If the Bears think Caleb Williams is the answer, the transformational franchise quarterback, then they're going to stay there and take it.
And they would be insane not to. I mean, that's at the end of the day, if you think you have the all-time great quarterback there, then you don't trade the pick no matter what. So we will have much more on this as we go. Again, Kliff Kingsbury is the jumping off to get Chris Canty into the conversation. We borrow him from Unsportsmanlike on ESPN Radio for a couple of minutes here this morning. So the conversation has turned to if There's two stories here, it feels like, running on parallel tracks. Is Chicago willing to entertain the possibility of a trade, be it to Washington or anywhere else? And, as Domonique brought up, does Caleb Williams have a real interest in going home or somewhere else? And if so, is he willing to utilize whatever leverage he may have to force something to happen? How do you see it?
Well, let's tackle the first one. Should Chicago entertain it? Will they entertain it? My point to that is they may not have a choice, because if Caleb Williams opens his mouth and says he doesn't want to play for the Chicago Bears, then all of a sudden they have to consider potentially making a deal with the Washington Commanders. Mike Tannenbaum says this all the time. Fear does the work of reason. Well, if you're the Chicago Bears and you're afraid that Caleb Williams could potentially sit out an entire calendar year after you take him number one, knowing that he doesn't want to be there, then you have to potentially be interested in a trade package that Washington would have to offer up. And just thinking about what Carl Williams said in that GQ article that came out in the fall, that's Caleb Williams' father, he said he talked to Lincoln Riley, and the reason why Kyler Murray struggled is because of the organization that he went to. He also mentioned Archie Manning in that article and talking about how that knocked the career out of him being with the New Orleans Saints. They all understand that the NFL, the way it's set up, is that the best players go to the worst teams, and that could undermine the career that Caleb could potentially have when he makes the jump to the NFL. And so in reading the tea leaves, it feels like a situation that the father and the son want to absolutely be comfortable with the situation that Caleb is stepping into in the NFL. And I don't know how you make him more comfortable than having the guy that was his offensive coordinator the year before at USC be his OC as his rookie year in Washington.
Playing in the city in which he grew up, whether we consider that to be, some players may not like that idea. Whatever. Either way, Neek, since you were the one who brought this up, let's just play the game where Caleb Williams is interested in finding his way somewhere else. Right. If you're the Bears, it seems to me, Domonique, you have an interest in finding that out as quickly as possible, because your leverage diminishes the moment the world knows that Caleb, you want teams to think it's your decision that you're trading the pick away, because if all of a sudden that asset becomes damaged, if the whole world knows you have to trade it away. So this may be something that happens quicker rather than, more quickly rather than more slowly, Neek. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great point. But if you are looking for a good situation, it would seem that the Bears, of the teams that are at the top of the draft, are one of the better situations considering the draft capital that they have. They have a true number one receiver already set in place. The big question is how long the coaching staff is going to continue to stay there, and how much faith you have in Eberflus in that offensive staff that he has assembled, that he's reassembling there now. So I think that's the big question if Caleb wants to move out. And I think it's important to reiterate that he hasn't suggested that he wants to move out, but I think that he should weigh all his options. You get one chance at this career. They don't give you a redo. And the way that it starts is as important as anything. It's almost as important as your own personal talent. So Caleb Williams and his team and his father should give it some hard thought and consider where they can end up and if it's the right place for him to start his career.
And I do think it's important to note the article you referenced with his father, I think that was before we knew who had the one pick, right?
Yes,
so he wasn't talking
the season.
He's not referencing Chicago specifically. No. And I think it's also important to remember that, if we go back to last year's draft, I think we all thought Bryce Young was landing in a better situation than C.J. Stroud was,
we did,
right?
For sure.
So we can't assume we know these things. Shane Waldron, the new offensive coordinator in Chicago, has a pretty good track record, right? Geno Smith, the last couple of years in Seattle, flourished under him. So it's possible you could sell yourself on Chicago as your destination. We're not saying Caleb Williams should want to avoid Chicago. It's just the possibility of wanting to engineer where you go.
What you're looking at is Matt Miller's most recent mock draft. In fact, it just came out this morning, and he has Caleb Williams going 1 to Chicago. This is after the Senior Bowl. He just posted. It's at the Draft Scout on Twitter as well, and he's going to join us a little later this morning. So something that should be mentioned. You mentioned that he said, the father of Caleb Williams said that Arizona turned out to be a bad situation. Well, the coach of Arizona was Kliff Kingsbury, for what it's worth. And so, I mean, take that for what it's worth. But here's the other side of it. If indeed Caleb Williams and his family don't want to go to Chicago, I don't want to hear it. The Bears have no one to blame for that but themselves. When you keep a coach in the situation they have with Matt Eberflus, you are doing exactly the same thing they did to Mitch Trubisky by keeping John Fox for 1 year when everyone knew that was a lame duck, and they're doing the same thing they did to Justin Fields by keeping Matt Nagy for 1 year when everyone knew it was a lame duck. So if you're Caleb Williams and you're looking at Chicago, you're saying, if I go in there as a rookie and we have a bad year, they're going to fire my coach. And so immediately, I'm looking at playing in 2 systems in my first 2 years. Look back on what that has done historically to young quarterbacks. It is the beginning of a kiss of death. So if he doesn't want to go to Chicago, I don't want to hear it. That is absolutely on them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the main negative about the Chicago Bears situation. I mean, listen, we know they got multiple picks from the trade that they had last year. They got a ton. I think they got the most cap space. But when you look at the situation, what players want most is stability, right? They don't want to. You don't want to have a lot of regime changes, coaching changes, stuff like that. And Chicago is like set up for something like that. If they have a bad year, man, Eberflus is going to be out of there. That's just what it's going to be. So if you're Caleb Williams and you're looking at the situation, do I really want to go into a situation where potentially I'm a rookie quarterback, we have a bad year, and the coach is out. Now I got a whole new staff. That's a recipe for disaster if you're a rookie quarterback coming in.
It's just tough to think you know what's going to happen, right? If I had sat here in November and told you guys Matt Eberflus was going to keep his job, you would have laughed me out of here.
Correct.
And he did. So, like, we don't know. Maybe the Bears have a good year, and he's the coach there for a long time. I just think it's very difficult if you're in this situation to look ahead and say this is going to turn out to be a good situation.